The origins of the iconic Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, turbine power, Ford turns Japanese, and a very real conversation between Ferruccio Lamborghini and Enzo Ferrari. All that and more on the Drive History podcast for March 12th through the 18th, coming your way right now.
It's time to cruise the highways and byways of the auto industry's past, present, and future. Join us in exploring the vehicles, people, events, and places that have shaped the way we move. This is the Drive History Podcast.
Good evening, everybody. Brian Corey here of This Day in Automotive History. My partner in crime, Jordan Stead, couldn't be here tonight, so I thought we'd shake things up, try something a little bit different. This is the Drive History Podcast for March 12th through March 18th. This is the 5th episode, and you can subscribe pretty much anywhere that podcasts are found. If you haven't listened before, it's very similar to the blog in which we just run through This Day in Automotive History facts for the day that they occurred on. Let's get started, shall we? March 12th, 1926, Bruce Myers, the inventor of the Myers-Manx dune buggy, is born. I've always been a fan of these little buggies built on Volkswagen Pans. I think they became popular first in the 1960s, and I know just recently they launched or are launching an EV version. I'm not entirely up to date on what's going on with that, but I'm pretty excited about it. It's an iconic design. It's one of those cars that's certainly on my want to own someday bucket list, but to be honest, there's plenty of those. Next, we have March 12th, 1952. Mercedes introduces the 300 SL race car, also known as the W194. It would help launch Mercedes' post-war racing efforts and would capture wins at the 24 Hours of Le Mans and the Carrera Pan America, a border-to-border race in Mexico. Its success would lead to a production version, which is heralded today as one of the most iconic collector vehicles, in part thanks to the coupe's gull-wing doors, a design necessity related to the construction of the frame. A version of this vehicle is among the most, or perhaps is the most, expensive car ever sold at auction. I believe it was a 300 SLR from 1955 that sold for something like $135 million. If that doesn't tell you about these vehicles' rarity and provenance, then I don't know what will. Of course, that particular vehicle is a much rarer version than the standard 300 SL, but I'll take any which one. Moving forward, March 12th, 1964, the first production Lamborghini, the 350 GT, debuts at the Geneva Auto Show. The prototype, the GTV, had debuted in Turin the previous October, sans engine, probably a few other parts. March 12th, 1982, Ford introduces the Ranger pickup truck. This comes on the heels of the introduction of the Bronco 2. And of course, Ford continues to make the Ranger today in one form or another. It's long been a popular pickup. I think it did really well as a smaller truck. And of course, there's not anything quite like that on the market these days. It's almost as if you're driving a car or crossover with a pickup bed. I know that the Ford Maverick is out there now. You have the Hyundai Santa Fe, but they just don't quite compare, do they? However, I'm very attracted to each of those vehicles. Not in a weird way. I just think they serve a purpose that the rest of the auto industry has failed to fill. Anyway, moving forward. March 12th, 1987, the Ferrari F40 debuts. Now, this is the last car that Enzo Ferrari would himself give the green light for production, and it is, of course, the 40th anniversary celebration for Ferrari production. It's an absolutely stunning car. There's not a whole lot I need to say that hasn't been said already. But if you haven't had the chance to see one in person, if you're ever in the LA area, I recommend taking a trip down to the vault of the Peterson Museum. They have an incredible Ferrari room. And there's, of course, one of these Ferrari F40s sitting down there. I think it was one of the vehicles which they only produced them in red. But, you know, when you have money, You can customize them. I've seen them in all sorts of colors nowadays. Moving on. March 13th, 1947. Maserati introduces its first production car, the A6 1500. This is quite a stunning vehicle. It's got coachwork by Pininfarina. It's almost like a Quella de Ville sort of car. Long front hood, small two-seat coupe. It's something that definitely reminds me of cartoons. It's how I would draw cars as a kid too. For some reason, you always have that vision of a vehicle just having a hood that's way too long. There's no possible way that an engine could sit under there and fill up the entire space. But back then, engines were big, even when they were small. I'm guessing, and I didn't do much research on this, the A6 1500, is that a 1500cc? Quite possibly, and that's not a very big engine. So it definitely didn't fill up the hood space. We'll just say that. March 13, 1969, The Love Bug hits theaters. Of course, you all know this, but it stars a 1963 Volkswagen Beetle named Herbie, alongside Dean Jones as Jim Douglas and Michelle Lee as Carol Burnett. This was certainly one of the movies that stoked my interest in cars as a kid. I watched a lot of fun car movies, The Love Bug, and TV shows, of course. Dukes of Hazzard, Duel, Steven Spielberg's feature-length debut. And The Love Bug is always one of those ones that you could just watch over and over and over. And of course, they made several sequels, and even just in the past decade or so, I believe there was a new one, and I believe it was Hilary Duff, wasn't that? Anyway, they're all good, and people thought so back then too, because it brought home $51 million in 1969 at the box office, which is no small sum. March 14th, 1914, Lee Petty, the patriarch of the racing family of the same name, is born. Funny enough, he didn't start his racing career until the age of 35. Now, that could be because there just wasn't a lot of opportunity to get into racing. I am not very familiar with his early life, but of course we know that Lee Petty is the father of Richard Petty, who is the grandfather of Adam Petty and several other race car drivers that continue to compete, I believe, to this day in NASCAR and other forms of racing. March 14th, 1954, Fiat tests the Turbina. It's a gas-powered prototype, and this was the first time that Fiat had debuted this sort of technology from its factory. Of course, it never would go into production, but it was a popular form of experimentation for power back then. Around the same time, Chrysler was doing a lot of turbine work, and that would result in a very limited run of production vehicles, the Chrysler turbine car, as it would come to be called, and I think there was 50 of them, and they were dispersed among general consumers who had the opportunity to test the technology in around 1959, 1960 or so. Out of those 50 cars, I believe there are 8 left. Jay Leno has one, and I want to say that Gilmore, but that might not be right, has one. Don't quote me on that. But I did have the opportunity to get my hands on one, quite literally. No, not in the sense of driving it, but I did some work for a high-end car dealer that specializes in rare classic vehicles, and they sold the last one to be in a private collection. And this was a couple years ago. An absolutely stunning vehicle. At the time, it didn't run, but I believe it is now restored and in running condition. Pretty fascinating if you ask me. March 14th, 1957, Ford introduces its retractable hardtop convertible, the Skyliner. Funny enough, I took a video of the hardtop going up and down on this car several years ago and threw it up on the Facebook page, and it garnered somewhere near 1 million views, I think, which blew my mind. But if you think about it, the technology was revolutionary. It had a huge motor in the trunk area, and for lack of a better term, the trunk would open, like an opposite that a normal trunk would, kind of how hardtop convertibles do today, or soft top convertibles, like for the compartment. But it was a giant area back there, and all the mechanicals for the convertible hardtop were tucked away into this little box, and the top would very slowly but automatically retract in and hide completely. And you still did have some room for luggage and other things, even with the trunk or with the top down. There was a little bit of a space to store your goods, shall we say. But that car certainly paved the way for hardtop convertibles today. If I remember correctly, there was another one that, or maybe one or two cars that came before it with similar technology, but the amount of vehicles produced by Ford really set the standard of mass production hardtop convertibles. Okay, let's move forward, shall we? March 15th, 1954, Porsche builds its 5,000th car. Mind you, Porsche, its first production vehicle, its first road-tested vehicle with a Porsche badge. I think it's an important distinction because, yes, there were vehicles built by Ferdinand Porsche prior to 1948, but none of them carried the badge or the name, and so it's up for debate as to what the actual first Porsche is. But the founding of Porsche, the celebration of Porsche, is generally held on June 8th to celebrate its unveiling and its road test of the first 356/1, I think is what they call it, in 1948. So just 6 years later, not quite 6 years later, the sports car company had produced 5,000 cars. It was probably a 356 based on, what they were building at the time, but it could have been something else, such as the Porsche 550. I think that was introduced in 1953. I could be wrong. Another iconic model certainly is the car that James Dean died while driving. Of course, that one is still missing, isn't it? If anybody knows where it is, feel free to leave me a comment. That would be great. Thank you. Okay, March 15th, 1961. The car that Enzo Ferrari once called the most beautiful in the world, the Jaguar E-Type, debuts. And it, too, is a stunning vehicle. Similar to the original Maserati car, it has a long flowing hood, small cabin area, definitely reminiscent of cartoons. I love these vehicles. I truly do. I don't know that much about them. They came with a variety of engine types. They came with automatics and manuals, and I'm no expert on them, but they are stunning to look at. And it is kind of surprising based on the year and model and what you get in terms of condition. They can be had for not an unreasonable amount of money in, somewhat drivable condition. And by unreasonable amount of money, it's nothing that I could probably afford. Maybe someday. Maybe if you want to support this podcast, I can buy a Jaguar E-Type. Feel free to Venmo me at Automotive History. March 15th, 1990, Ford releases the Explorer. This, of course, has become one of Ford's staple vehicles in its lineup over the years, and remains, I would believe, one of their best sellers. March 16th, 1928, the first permanent traffic lights are installed in Leeds, West Yorkshire. I put this fact in here, believing that it was the first permanent traffic lights in general, but reading it now, that seems very late. I think that there were actually traffic lights installed in Ohio previous to this, which seems like a random place, but we have to remember Ohio is a relatively wealthy state back in the day, and they really championed some certain technologies, including traffic lights and, I believe, paid parking meters. So thanks a lot, Ohio. March 16th, 1958, Ford builds its 50 millionth car, a 1958 Ford Thunderbird. This came 55 years after Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company. Of course, not to be outdone, on March 16th, the very same day, 1966, just 8 years later, General Motors produced its 100 millionth car, a 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. That car, along with the Cadillac Eldorado, I believe, remain iconic for being among the first mass-produced American front-wheel drive vehicles. I think there hadn't been one since the Cord L29 and the Cord 810 and 812 of the 1930s. Of course, today, most vehicles are. March 16th, 2013, the Mini Paceman went on sale in the USA. I had a Mini Clubman, and I have to say it was one of the most fun vehicles I ever owned. It was a 2008 R56 S, 6-speed, great gas mileage, real fun to drive, real zippy, and you can get a surprising amount of cargo in those things. And, not gonna lie, I certainly slept on in the back a time or two on a few of my solo road trips. Jumping ahead to March 17th, happy St. Patrick's Day. On March 17th, 1948, Hell's Angels is formed by the Bishop family in Fontana, California. It's unclear exactly where the name originated from, but it certainly seems inspired by the nickname for World War II fighter pilots, as well as a Howard Hughes film by the same name that came out in, I think, 1930, and that was about World War I pilots. So, given that at the time, 1948, all these young men had recently returned from the war, adrenaline pumping, they're used to flying planes, driving tanks, riding jeeps, motorcycle clubs, hot rodding, all of that was just in their blood. Like, it gave them a sense of community. A lot of times they were with fellow vets. It was by no means something malicious, even though today, believe it or not, the Hells Angels is considered a organized crime syndicate by the FBI, I believe. Pretty fascinating, but I think that's a story for a different day. On March 17th, 1972, the Japanese-built Ford Courier mini pickup goes on sale in the U.S. thanks to a partnership between Ford and Mazda. It's my understanding that that was an effort led by Lee Iacocca at Ford, kind of foreseeing the gas crisis and knowing that there would be a lot of emission standards and rising fuel prices. And so by partnering with these companies that weren't really well established in the U.S., coming out of Japan, but knowing that they still had, they were still well regarded for their reliability and fuel efficiency. They brought the Mazda brand into the U.S. via that partnership, while giving Ford access to a lot of smaller vehicle technology. Because at the time, let's face it, American cars were land yachts, and to this day, I feel like most of them still are. Although we have a greater selection, in part thanks to these sorts of partnerships. March 17th, 1977, the Lamborghini Cheetah off-road vehicle was shown at the Geneva Motor Show. If you haven't seen a Lamborghini Cheetah, just Google it. It's hard to believe, but Lamborghini did build a 4x4 off-road SUV-type vehicle in the 70s. They're quite rare, I'm sure, but really, really a fascinating vehicle. And on March 17th, 2006, the final Chevrolet SSR is built. Now, the SSR is, of course, a modern version of the El Camino, but it looks more like a Chevy truck out of the 30s or 40s. I'm not really sure what they were trying to do with this thing, but it was almost like a performance pickup truck that was the size of a car, yet it proved not quite as functional in either regard. You weren't going to use it to haul wood chips or move a couch, and it wasn't quite something that you would take to the track, but it does have an iconic design. It came at a time when a lot of car companies were focused on retro designs, and I believe that it did last for 3 to 4 years. Now, within that time, of course, they didn't sell any crazy amount of them, but you could get them with the same drivetrain as a Corvette, including a manual transmission, which is pretty sweet, if you ask me. March 18th, 1947, William Durant, the founder of General Motors, died at the age of 85. Some say he died penniless. I cannot find any provable information as to what his circumstance was. There's plenty of quotes saying that he loved to gamble on the American auto industry, or things to that degree. And to be honest, he really was a pioneer in the industry, founding General Motors in 1908. Basically, after acquiring Buick, he would get kicked out of General Motors only to buy his way back in after founding Chevrolet with Louis Chevrolet. And ultimately, he would be kicked to the curb again, I think, by the early 1920s. He just couldn't quite maintain the financials needed to give everybody that owned a little bit of the stock the assurance they needed to leave him in power. March 18th, 2018. A self-driving car operating as a rideshare vehicle struck a pedestrian in Tempe, Arizona. The victim, Elaine Herzberg, died soon after, marking the first autonomous vehicle-related death of a pedestrian. Absolutely tragic, and it's hard to believe that was 6 years ago. When you think of autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, it feels like they're not quite even here yet. Of course, Tesla has autopilot, and there's other variations of that. So to see that the first death caused by a self-driving car occurred 6 years ago, I guess that makes sense. And unfortunately, Elaine Herzberg made her way into the history books as the person that is associated with that event. All right, that kind of does it for the This Day in Automotive History portion of the Drive History podcast. But given the amount of Lamborghini and Ferrari chatter in this episode, I thought we would try something a little bit different. And imagine how one fateful conversation between Ferruccio Lamborghini and Enzo Ferrari may have gone. If you're not familiar, Ferruccio Lamborghini was a tractor producer, AC. He made air conditioning, and he really made a fortune in pre- and post-war Italy. And he was a avid car enthusiast, and he actually purchased several Ferraris, was a regular customer of Enzo. But when he started to have trouble with one of his Ferraris, he decided to go see Mr. Ferrari himself. So let's picture ourselves in Maranello, Italy, 1963. Actually, I believe it was a few years before that. Don't quote me on that. But let's picture ourselves in Maranello, Italy. We're walking into Enzo Ferrari's office. Enzo Ferrari. Ferruccio, what brings you to Maranello today? Enzo, I've come to discuss a rather pressing matter regarding one of your cars. Oh? What seems to be the issue? It's about the clutch in my Ferrari 250 GT. It keeps giving me trouble. Enzo, I've had to replace it twice already, and yet the problem persists. Is that so? Well, Ferruccio, You must understand that our cars are finely crafted machines. Perhaps it's not the clutch that's the issue, but rather your driving technique. Enzo, I assure you, it is not my driving. This is not a matter of technique. Your engineers need to address this flaw in your design. Flaw? In a Ferrari? I find that hard to believe. Our cars are the epitome of performance and precision. Well, it seems you're unwilling to acknowledge any fault in your precious creations, Enzo. I expected better from you. Ferruccio, let me give you a piece of advice. Let me make cars. You stick to making tractors. Ha! Famous last words, Mr. Ferrari. Ferruccio turns and leaves Ferrari's office, yet Enzo calls out behind him. Let yourself dream, Lamborghini. Building cars is not a farmer's job. Ha, ha, ha. Okay, it's a brief episode, but I think that we can do okay with that on this time. Jordan again couldn't be here. We're trying something new. I actually feel pretty good about it. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Again, please subscribe to the Drive History Podcast anywhere that you listen. Perhaps we'll do some more of these live ones. I really appreciate anybody who listened. And this will be live tomorrow on March 12th on Spotify, on Apple, Google Podcast, YouTube, all the places. So once again, thank you for listening. Till next time, drive history every day.